Today, the 22nd of February 2024, media outlets across the United States are going crazy with this story. The claim that last night a solar flare was so strong that it knocked out a bunch of cell towers for Verizon and at&t, and everyone lost phone service. Is this true? The answer is a categorical no. A solar flare did not cause at&t to lose the phone network. A longer question: can a solar flare potentially cause similar impacts? The answer is maybe. So, to dive into this question, let's first ask, what is a solar flare? A solar flare is a burst of energy in the atmosphere of the sun, where magnetic energy is converted to the acceleration of particles, the heating of plasma, and light. This is from radio waves all the way down to X-rays across that spectrum. Now, when a flare happens, that light is sent out in all directions at the speed of light, and as soon as we're able to see it at Earth, it's already arrived, because the solar flare is the light that we're observing. Now, when this high energy wavelength of light, such as X-rays, collide with the upper atmosphere of the Earth, it causes the upper atmosphere to expand slightly. And what this means is that radio waves, which normally propagate through the Earth's atmosphere by bouncing up and down the atmosphere, can no longer travel through the atmosphere as effectively. So a result of this is we get what we call a radio blackout, where radio waves aren't traveling as well through the atmosphere, so the signal is sort of not working. But crucially, because it is the light that is doing this, the X-rays as it arrives at Earth, this only affects the day side of the Earth, where the light can reach. So, okay, what's the problem then? Then surely this is possible. Could this have happened last night? The answer is no, for two reasons. The first reason is that the USA was at nighttime at the time these cell towers went down. There was a flare just after sunset for Pacific East Coast time, and another flare about 2 a.m, but neither of these were facing the United States at the time. So that's number one. It was on the night side of the Earth. Sort of second half reason is the flares weren't that big. They were X-class solar flares. This is the largest category of solar flare, but it was an X1 class flare, so the smallest flare you can have in that largest category. And I think they clock in at the 9th and 11th biggest flares that we've had in just under 2 years, so overall not enormous. But the second primary reason are the wavelengths or the frequencies of radio waves that are affected by this radio blackout. Primarily, the wavelengths that are affected by this are wavelengths that are used for GPS, for sort of ham radio, drone operation, things like that. These are degraded during a radio blackout. But your mobile phone and mobile phone towers use a very different frequency of radio waves that are not impacted in this same way. In theory, if you had a large enough flare, whether it be 20, 50, or even 100 times larger than the two solar flares we had last night, in theory, you could disrupt phone signals coming from phones and phone towers. But yesterday's events just weren't big enough, and it was night time anyway. So I sort of tweeted about this and immediately was getting picked up by a lot of media outlets and a bunch of people in my replies on Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it, saying, hey, you haven't thought about satellites. You haven't thought about the atmosphere. You haven't thought about the Earth's magnetic field, all of these things, okay? Thinking somehow they're more of an expert on this subject than whatever. They've read one article, they think they're experts, whatever. Happy to reply to those comments, but basically, most of these people are confusing two things. They're conflating a solar flare, which is a burst of energy in the atmosphere of the sun, and we see that as light, as X-rays, with a second phenomena, which is called a coronal mass ejection. Now, a coronal mass ejection is associated with a solar flare. They happen together about 50% of the time. They are different things. And a coronal mass ejection is an eruption of plasma from the sun's atmosphere. So an ejection of mass from the corona, which is what we call the atmosphere of the sun. Now, coronal mass ejections do not travel at the speed of light as solar flares do. They travel at a few hundred, maybe 1,000 or so miles per second, so very, very fast, but still takes a day, 2 to 5 days to reach the Earth. Now, when this coronal mass ejection arrives at the Earth, it carries with it a magnetic field that is carried from the sun, and as this passes over satellites and interacts with the Earth's magnetic field, it causes a change in magnetic environments that can cause electric currents and can disrupt and can even break satellites, power grids, cell towers, for example. So that physical process is possible for these things to be damaged. But the bulk of the damage that is possible from the sun is not from a solar flare, because that just causes this high frequency radio blackouts on the day side, but sort of the more global impacts come from the eruption that comes with the flare, maybe, and not from the flare itself. And we have a few days notice for seeing when that will arrive. So last night's X-class solar flares, of which there were 2, neither of these produced a significant eruption, for one, and secondly, even if they had produced an eruption, it wouldn't be here yet. It would take several days to arrive. So there you go. Despite the media hype, despite what you might be seeing online, whatever happened to Verizon and at&t was not related to the sun. And a final thing to note, I think, is to hypothesize on where this story came from. As far as I can tell, it came from some local media outlets, maybe in Florida, where some journalists were just speculating on the coincidence of the correlation, saying, hey, this has happened, this also happened, that's interesting, maybe there might be a relation here, and that story sort of got picked up by the next person who got picked up by the next person, and a few sort of rounds of the Chinese whispers, and it was being spouted by a bunch of news agencies as fact. So don't believe everything you see online, and if you're unsure about these things, reach out to an expert and seek their opinion. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed. Follow if you're interested in more content about the sun.